My name is Judith Carter, and I was 73 years old when my own children stopped looking me in the eye. Not out of anger, out of pity, because in their minds, I had become the widow who had lost her judgment, the woman who had fallen in love with a man 28 years younger on the other side of the world. Nobody believed me, not my daughter, not my son, not the friends I had known for 30 years. They all believed I was being taken advantage of, that an old woman traveling alone had simply been an easy target. It took a very unexpected discovery to change everything they thought they knew, to reveal who was really acting out of love and who had been acting out of fear. But that part of the story comes later. First, I need to tell you how I got there in the first place, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. I spent 32 years teaching history at a small public school in Oregon, the kind of school where everybody knows everybody, where the students sitting in front of you are the children of students you taught 20 years earlier. My husband Robert was a civil engineer. He built bridges and highways across the state, the kind of quiet, steady work that never made headlines, but held entire communities together. We married when I was 23, and we stayed married for 42 years, until cancer took him one winter I still can't fully remember. I remember the doctors. I remember the hospital hallways. I remember the smell of hand sanitizer that seemed to follow me everywhere for months afterward. But the months themselves blurred into a single gray smear in my memory, the way grief sometimes erases the details it can't bear to keep. After that, the days all started to look the same. I woke up early, out of habit rather than necessity. I watered the plants Robert had put in years before, in the same corners of the yard he had chosen. I drank my coffee alone in the same chair I always sat in, and I waited for the phone to ring. Sometimes it did. My children would call, ask if I was okay, and I always said yes. Neither of us really believed it. My daughter Carol lived in Seattle. She worked in accounting, had 2 teenage children, and a schedule so full that our phone calls rarely lasted more than 10 minutes. My son Mark lived in Texas. He worked in technology, was quieter than his sister, but always texted on Sundays just to check in. They both had their own lives, their own children, and I had a house far too large for one person. 4 bedrooms, 1 for each child, 1 for guests who almost never came, and ours, which I still called ours, 2 years after Robert had passed. It was Carol who first suggested the trip, on an ordinary Sunday evening during one of those short phone calls. "Mom, you need to get out of that house," she said. "Go see the world while you still can." I laughed at the time. I told her I was too old for adventures, but the sentence stuck with me for weeks afterward. While you still can, as if there were a deadline on everything I still wanted to do, and maybe there was. I started researching late at night when I couldn't sleep, watching videos of older people living abroad. Thailand, Mexico, Portugal. But it was a friend from church who first mentioned the Philippines, a woman who had gone years earlier to visit the family of a former student, and who talked about the beaches, the kindness of the people, the low cost of living. To me, it sounded like another planet entirely. And maybe that was exactly what I needed. A place where nobody knew me as the sad widow from Maple Street. My children thought it was a good idea at first. Mark even helped book the hotel, researched safe neighborhoods, compared flight prices. Carol sent me a whole list of precautions: sunscreen, medications, travel insurance. My daughter has always been like that, careful to a fault, organized since she was a little girl. I had no idea that the very same list, the very same care, would one day turn into suspicion. In the weeks before I left, I organized the house as if I were leaving forever. I packed away photos of Robert into boxes, not because I wanted to forget him, but because looking at them every single day had stopped hurting less and started hurting differently. The trip to Manila was long, 22 hours between flights and connections, Portland to San Francisco, then an overnight flight that seemed to have no end. I was 73 years old, and my whole body ached by the time I arrived. But when the airport doors opened and the humid heat wrapped around me like a warm blanket somebody had forgotten to pull out of the dryer, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, not fear, not sadness, just curiosity. Outside the airport, the traffic terrified me. Motorcycles slipping between cars with inches to spare, horns sounding from every direction. I sat there clutching my purse like we were driving into a war zone. The driver who picked me up that first day wasn't Daniel, but it was he who recommended him, a younger man he knew. "If you ever need someone you can trust," he told me as he dropped me at the hotel, "I have my friend Daniel's number. He knows this city better than I do." At the time, it meant nothing at all. It was just a number scrawled on the back of a taxi receipt that I threw to the bottom of my bag. The hotel I had booked was in Makati. Nothing fancy, just a clean room I could afford for a month while I figured things out. On the first night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. No television, no music, no distractions, just me. And for the first time since leaving home, the excitement disappeared, replaced by a quiet doubt. "What are you doing here? Why did you think this was a good idea? Have you completely lost your mind?" That first night, I almost changed my return flight. I opened the airline's website and looked at the earliest available dates. 3 weeks, 2 weeks, maybe even the following week. Nobody would blame me. My children would probably be relieved. But then I remembered a promise I had made to myself before leaving Oregon. No matter how afraid I felt, I owed this new life at least 1 week. I closed the laptop and went to sleep. In the first few days, I felt completely lost. The traffic in Manila kept frightening me. The heat was exhausting, and everything felt too different to ever feel familiar. But little by little, I started walking farther, a little more each day. I discovered a bakery on the corner where the woman behind the counter began to recognize me, recommending her favorite items. I discovered a market 10 minutes from the hotel where I could buy fruits I had never seen in my life. There was an older woman who sold flowers on the sidewalk in front of the hotel every morning, and she waved at me even on the days I didn't buy anything. One day I finally bought a small bouquet just to put on the table in my room, and she was so pleased she gave me 2 extra flowers as a gift. Small gestures like that began to make me feel a little less like a foreigner and a little more like I belonged to something. In the evenings, I would call Carol or Mark, tell them about my day, the bakery, the market, the flower seller. They laughed, asked for details. Back then it was still easy. Back then I was still just the adventurous mother who had gone traveling. Nobody suspected anything because there was nothing yet to suspect. It was on the 4th day that I needed a driver to get to that bigger market on the other side of the city, and I called the number I had written down. That was how I met Daniel. He was 45 years old, shared a car with his younger brother, and spoke a careful, almost formal English, the kind of English you learn from books rather than from the street. On the way, he asked where I was from, what I was doing traveling alone, an American woman with no husband, no family beside her. I told him I was a retired teacher, that my husband had passed away 2 years earlier, and that I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. He listened without rushing, without that look of pity I knew so well back home. He just listened, as if what I was saying actually mattered. At the end of the ride, he simply said, "I'm sorry for your loss. If you ever need someone to show you the city, I'm here." There was nothing strange in it. It sounded like ordinary kindness, the kind I had forgotten how to receive. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became my regular driver. He took me to the market, to old churches scattered across the city, to a lookout point where you could see the entire bay at sunset, the sky turning orange and then purple behind the buildings. Little by little, the rides grew longer than they needed to be. Sometimes he would pull the car over just so we could keep talking. He told me about his wife, who had died giving birth to their second child almost 20 years earlier. About raising his 2 sons alone, working as a driver in the mornings and as a security guard at night for years on end, without ever taking a single weekend off. I recognized something in him, a certain tired loneliness I knew all too well. Maybe that was what drew us together first. Not romance, just 2 tired people who were exhausted from carrying the weight of what they had lost, all alone. One Saturday, he took me to see the neighborhood where his sons had grown up. A narrow street full of children playing, women sitting in doorways, talking. His 2 boys came out to greet us, shy at first, then curious about the American woman who talked to their father every single day. The younger one asked if I was really a teacher. When I said yes, he got excited and spent the whole afternoon showing me his school notebook. That day, I realized I wasn't just getting to know a man. I was getting to know an entire family that had already survived more loss than most people face in a lifetime. My trip, which was only supposed to last 3 weeks, turned into 6. I called Carol and told her I was going to stay longer. She asked why. I said I was feeling good there, that I had made friends. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't even know yet what it was myself. I only knew that I thought about him more than I probably should think about a taxi driver. It was on a rainy afternoon that everything changed. Our car got stuck in traffic for 2 hours. The rain hammered against the windshield so hard it was difficult to see the street. And instead of sitting in silence, we talked the entire time about fear, about regret, about what it means to start over after a certain age. He told me he was afraid of dying alone, of spending the rest of his life just working, never feeling again what he had felt when he was young and married. I told him I understood that fear exactly. When we finally arrived at the hotel, he said quietly, "I didn't expect to feel this again, for anyone." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, feeling my heart beat the way it hadn't beaten in years. After a long silence, I said, "I don't think I expected it either." That night, lying in my hotel room, I laughed to myself like a teenager, and then I cried because it felt like betrayal, feeling something like that again, as if I were forgetting Robert. It took me days to understand that it wasn't forgetting. It was simply a heart that still had room for more. When I told Carol on the phone a few weeks later, the silence on the other end lasted what felt like a full minute. "Mom, you're 73, she said. He's 45. That doesn't make any sense." I tried to explain that it wasn't about numbers. It was about being seen again, about someone wanting to know how my day had been. She didn't want to hear it. She said she needed to hang up, that she would call back later. She didn't call that night. Mark was worse. When Carol told him, he called me directly, no hesitation at all. "Mom, this is a scam," he said. "Everyone knows how these stories end. An older woman traveling alone with savings and a younger man." I felt anger, and I also felt fear, because part of me wondered if they were right, if I really was a foolish old woman, easy to deceive. My friends from church, when they found out over the phone, were equally worried. One of them went so far as to say, "Judith, men like that know exactly what to say to women like us." I answered that Daniel had never asked me for a single dollar. Nobody seemed to hear that part. Everyone had already decided how the story was going to end. The truth is, I was afraid too. Not of Daniel, but of being wrong about him. So I started paying attention, carefully, as if it were an investigation rather than a courtship. I noticed how he treated other drivers with respect, how he talked about his sons with pride rather than obligation, how he was never late, never made excuses, never asked for anything beyond my company. Daniel never asked me for money, not once. He even refused when I tried to pay for a repair on his car. "That's my problem," he said. "You don't need to fix my life for me." Once I tried to leave extra cash hidden in the seat of the car. He called me that same night to return it, said he didn't want me thinking he needed charity. Still, my family wouldn't calm down. Carol called every single day, asking for details. How much did he earn? Where did he live? Had I seen his house? Carol went so far as to hire a private investigator without telling me. I only found out afterward when she called nearly in tears, saying she needed to tell me something. The investigator had found records of Daniel transferring money every single month to an unknown account in a distant province. Carol was certain it was the proof. "Mom, he's sending money to someone," she said. "He has another family, or another scam. I need you to come home right now." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything I had built over the past few months. Was it possible that I had been so naive, so desperate for attention, that I hadn't seen what everyone around me seemed to see so clearly? I thought about Robert, about what he would say if he could see me in that moment, doubting a man who had never once given me a reason to doubt him. The next morning, I asked Daniel directly, no hesitation. I showed him what Carol had discovered. Daniel went silent for a long time, long enough for my heart to start sinking. Then he picked up his phone and showed me the receipts, all of them, years of transfers, one every single month without fail. The money wasn't going to another woman. It wasn't going to a scheme. It was going to a small orphanage in the province where he had been born, where he had been raised for a few months after his parents died in a bus accident when he was only 8 years old, before an uncle took custody of him and his younger brother. He explained that every single month, since he first started working as a driver, he had sent part of his salary to help the children who were still there, children who had never known their parents, just as he had barely known his own. He had never told anyone, because to him it wasn't generosity. It was simply an obligation to the place that had cared for him when he needed it most. "My sister sent me there when I was 8 years old," he told me. "I stayed 6 months in that orphanage until my uncle managed to get us out. I never forgot what it was like, sleeping in a bed shared with 3 other children, not knowing if anyone was ever coming to get you." He showed me an old photograph, worn soft at the edges, kept folded in his wallet. "My brother and me the day we left that place," he said, looking at the photo with tired eyes. "I never let myself forget what it feels like to be a child that nobody is fighting for." I was speechless. I called Carol right away and told her everything, word for word. There was a long silence, and then she said quietly, "Mom, I just wanted to protect you." I told her I understood, but that maybe the person who needed protecting wasn't me. Maybe it was the trust our family had lost since Robert's death, the trust that good things could still happen without a hidden price attached. What happened after that was something nobody expected. Carol asked to meet Daniel over video call the following week. The conversation started uncomfortable. cold, full of direct questions. Where do you live? How much do you earn? Why would a 73-year-old woman? But Daniel answered every single one, calmly, honestly, without getting defensive. At one point, Carol asked, "What do you want from my mother?" And Daniel answered slowly, "I want what she's already given me. Someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who asks how my day was and actually waits to hear the answer." By the end, Carol said something I never expected to hear. "I think I was afraid of losing my mother," she said. "Not afraid that you were a bad man." Mark took longer to come around. He only fully believed it when he flew to Manila himself months later and saw with his own eyes how Daniel treated me, with patience, with respect, never in a hurry. Mark spent an entire week with us, watching quietly the way he always did. He saw Daniel help me up the stairs without my even asking. He saw Daniel remember that I didn't like spicy food without needing to be reminded twice. Mark told me at the airport before flying back to Texas, "Mom, I was wrong. I just wanted to see you happy, and I think I forgot that you deserve that too." After that week, things began to change. Carol called less to check up on me and more just to talk. She started asking about the orphanage, about the children Daniel helped. One day she called me, excited, saying she had organized a fundraiser among her co-workers to send school supplies to the children in the province. I cried on the phone, not from sadness, but because my family had found a way to be part of it too. Today, Daniel and I live together in a simple house on the outskirts of Manila, with a small yard where I've planted some of the same flowers Robert used to grow back in Oregon. We never married. We didn't need a piece of paper to prove anything to each other. I still miss Robert every single day. Loving Daniel didn't erase that. It only showed me that the heart has room for more than one story. My children visit every year now. Carol even helps Daniel organize the donations for the orphanage. She says she wants to be part of it too. Mark video calls every week, not out of obligation anymore, but because he genuinely wants to know how the garden is doing, how the children at the orphanage are doing, how Daniel and I are doing. Sometimes I think about how it all started. A number scrawled on the back of a receipt, a taxi ride in the rain. And I realize it wasn't luck. It was courage. The courage to refuse to accept that my story was already over, just because Robert was gone, just because I was 73 years old, just because everyone expected me to sit quietly in a house too big for one person, waiting for a phone that rarely rang. There's something I haven't mentioned yet, something that took shape slowly during those first weeks, long before Daniel and I ever admitted anything to each other. It was the way Manila itself started to feel less like a foreign city and more like a place that was quietly, patiently, waiting for me to notice it. I remember the first time I sat in a small coffee shop near my hotel, just to get out of my room for a while. The woman behind the counter called me by name after only 3 visits. Back home, I could go weeks without a conversation lasting more than a few minutes. A cashier, a neighbor, a doctor's receptionist, most interactions felt rushed, transactional, everyone busy, everyone moving. Here, nobody seemed in a hurry to end the conversation. I couldn't explain it, and I still can't completely explain it. But when I finally stood up to leave that coffee shop, something felt different. The city hadn't changed. The traffic was still outside. The heat was still there. I was still thousands of miles from home. But for the first time since landing, Manila felt a little less intimidating, a little less foreign, a little more human. That afternoon I walked farther than I had planned. The afternoon after that, I did it again. And by the end of my first week, something unexpected had happened. I wasn't counting the days until my flight home anymore. In fact, I had started looking for reasons to stay longer. I found an English conversation group that met on Saturday mornings in a small community room underneath a church in Makati. Nothing fancy, plastic chairs, a few folding tables, a ceiling fan working harder than anything else in the building. I almost walked right past the flyer advertising it the first time I saw it. Then I stopped, turned around, and decided to go. There was a girl there, only about 12 years old, who sat in the back corner clutching a notebook against her chest like it contained state secrets. When it was her turn to read aloud, she barely raised her voice above a whisper. I could see she knew the answers. She just wasn't confident enough to share them. Something about that reminded me of myself, not at 12, at 67, and then again at 73. Every time I doubted whether I had any right to be building a new life so far from everything familiar. Every Saturday I kept showing up. At first I told myself I was helping the students. The truth was they were helping me just as much, maybe more. For a few hours each week, I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a retiree trying to figure out what came next. I wasn't the woman who had flown across the world because she felt lost. I was simply Judith, the volunteer, the teacher, the lady who corrected pronunciation and carried extra pencils in her bag. And it felt good, much better than I expected. Her name was Sophia, that same shy girl from the back corner. She started talking more slowly at first, a sentence here, a question there. Then one Saturday, she stayed behind after everyone else left. She wanted help preparing for a school presentation. We sat together for nearly an hour, practicing, repeating difficult words, working through her nervousness one step at a time. When she finally finished, she looked at me and smiled, a real smile, the kind that appears when somebody accomplishes something they genuinely didn't think they could do. I can't explain why that moment stayed with me, but it did. A few weeks later, one of the other volunteers told me something I hadn't known. Sophia's father worked overseas. He had been gone for years. Her mother worked long hours most days. Sophia spent more time helping raise her younger siblings than focusing on herself. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense: the seriousness, the responsibility, the way she always seemed older than her age. And I found myself thinking about how many people quietly carry burdens nobody else can see, children included. It was through that same volunteer group that I first began to understand what kind of man Daniel really was. Long before I understood what kind of feelings I had for him. He would sometimes wait outside after dropping me off, not because I had asked him to, but because he said the streets weren't always safe once the sun went down, and he didn't like the idea of me walking home alone in the dark. I told him more than once that he didn't need to do that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. He always just smiled and said the same thing. I know you are. I just like knowing you're safe anyway. There were mornings when I woke up convinced I was building a new life, full of purpose and possibility. There were afternoons when I wondered if I had completely lost my mind. One week I would be exploring neighborhoods I had never seen before, trying foods I couldn't pronounce, laughing at my own mistakes with the language. The next week I would be sitting alone in my apartment, missing my family so much it physically hurt. Nobody talks about that part. People tell stories about moving abroad as if it's one single decision. It isn't. It's dozens of decisions, hundreds of them, and many of those decisions happen after you've already arrived, after the excitement of the airport and the novelty of the first days has worn away, leaving only the daily, unglamorous work of building an actual life in an unfamiliar place. I think that's part of why my children struggled so much to understand what was happening to me. From the outside, all they could see was the ending of the story. A woman in her 70s falling for a man decades younger. They couldn't see the hundreds of small decisions that had led there. The Saturday mornings in that church basement. The slow trust built one honest conversation at a time. The quiet consistency of a man who showed up exactly when he said he would, week after week, without ever once asking me for anything in return. I would say this: nobody has the right to decide when your heart should stop searching, not even you. I was 73 years old when I thought my story was already written. I was wrong. The best chapter was still ahead of me. Sometimes Daniel asks me if I miss Oregon, and I tell him the truth. I miss the house, Robert's plants, the smell of rain in the fall, but I don't miss the silence of that house that was too big, waiting for a telephone that almost never rang. Last month, the two of us went to visit the orphanage Daniel has supported for so many years. The children ran to greet us. A little girl, no older than 7, took my hand and asked if I was Uncle Daniel's wife. I smiled and said, "I'm his friend, his best friend." That seemed to satisfy her completely, and she ran off to play with the other children. On the way home, Daniel held my hand in the car without saying a word. He didn't need to. After 73 years, I finally understood that love doesn't have a correct age, or a correct passport, or a correct way of arriving. It simply arrives when you have the courage to leave the door open, even after you thought you had closed it forever, but it arrived, and that's all that matters. People sometimes ask me if I have any regrets, if I wish I had done things differently, arrived at this life sooner, made peace with my children faster, trusted Daniel from the very first conversation instead of spending all those anxious nights doubting him. And the honest answer is no, because every single one of those difficult nights taught me something I needed to learn. That love without questions isn't wisdom, it's just blind hope. That real trust isn't given freely on the first day. It's built slowly, through 100 small, honest moments, the kind that can't be faked for very long. I think about the woman I was before I got on that plane, the woman who watered another man's garden every morning out of habit, who answered the phone the same way every single time. "Fine, I'm fine. Don't worry about me." That woman believed her story had already reached its final chapter. She believed grief was simply something you learned to live inside of, like a room you never leave again. I don't blame her. She was doing the best she could with what she had. But I'm glad she got on that plane anyway, even while she was still afraid, even while she still didn't fully believe she deserved anything more than quiet days and a house full of memories. There's a particular kind of loneliness that nobody warns you about when you become a widow later in life. It isn't dramatic. Nobody is shouting or crying in the street. It's quiet. It's grocery shopping for one person and forgetting how to portion vegetables for a single meal. It's setting the table out of habit before remembering there's only one plate to lay down. It's a kind of silence that settles into your bones until you almost forget what it felt like not to carry it. Daniel understood that silence without my ever needing to explain it to him, because he had lived inside his own version of it for nearly 20 years. Maybe that's why we recognized each other so quickly. Two people who had learned to survive loneliness so well that we had almost convinced ourselves it was simply who we were now. I think about Sophia sometimes, one of the older girls who used to help around the orphanage, teaching the younger children their letters in the afternoons. She once told me in careful English that she thought I was very brave for coming so far, all alone, at my age. I told her the truth. I said I wasn't brave when I got on that plane. I was just tired of being afraid of everything else. My friends back home still ask, from time to time, if I'm ever coming back to Oregon for good. I always tell them the same thing. Never say never. Life has surprised me before. It will probably surprise me again. But for now, when I wake up each morning and hear the sounds of the city outside my window, mixed with the sound of Daniel making coffee in the kitchen, I know exactly where I want to be. And that certainty took me 73 years to find. I used to think that starting over meant leaving everything behind, erasing the life you had built before, as if love for someone new required forgetting someone you had loved for over 4 decades. I don't believe that anymore. I carry Robert with me everywhere I go, in the flowers I plant, in the way I still fold laundry exactly the way he liked his shirts folded, in the quiet gratitude I feel every single day for the 42 years we had together. And I carry Daniel with me too, in an entirely different way, not as a replacement for anything, but as proof that a life doesn't have to end just because one chapter closes. Proof that a 73-year-old woman can still be surprised by her own heart. Proof that families can be wrong and can also find their way back to being right if everyone involved is willing to listen instead of simply assuming the worst. If you had told me, sitting in that quiet house in Oregon 2 years after Robert passed, that I would one day be living in the Philippines, in love with a man 28 years younger than me, helping to raise money for an orphanage on the other side of the world, I would have told you that you were mistaken about me entirely. I would have said that wasn't the kind of woman I was. But I think that's the secret nobody tells you about grief and about aging and about starting over. You don't know what kind of woman you are, not really, until life asks something unexpected of you, until you're standing in an airport 8,000 miles from everything familiar, wondering if you've lost your mind completely, and discovering instead that you've simply found a part of yourself you thought had disappeared for good. I was 73 years old when my children stopped looking me in the eye. Today, they look at me differently, not with pity, but with something closer to respect, and maybe even a little bit of wonder, because in the end, this was never really a story about the Philippines, or about a driver, or about the 28 years between our ages. It was always a story about a woman who refused to believe that her life was finished, simply because one chapter had ended. I used to think forgiveness was something you offered other people. I've since learned it's just as often something you have to offer yourself. For every year you spent believing you had already used up your share of happiness, for every doubt you let other people plant in a heart that was only ever guilty of wanting to feel alive again. I forgave myself for being afraid in that hotel room on the first night. I forgave myself for almost getting on the earlier flight home. I forgave my children for their suspicion, because I understood, eventually, that it came from love, twisted into fear, the same fear I carried myself in the quietest hours of those uncertain months. And I forgave the version of me who once believed that 73 was too late for anything at all. There can always be another chapter, another beginning, another version of yourself waiting somewhere you never expected to find it. I found mine in the back seat of a taxi, in the middle of a rainstorm, thousands of miles from the house where I thought my story would quietly end. And I wouldn't trade a single frightened, uncertain, doubtful moment of that journey, because every one of them led me here, to a life I never knew I was still allowed to want.